Welcome to the Kingsburg Community Church podcast, Thinking About Faith. We pray that this podcast helps you deepen your faith in God and stir some inner thoughts about the Christian life.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the second episode of the KCC podcast, Thinking About Faith. And today we're going to deal with a subject that is something that I've been interested in ever since I was a young boy, first came to faith. And that is, what is the relationship between faith and science? I grew up in a time when it was popular for people to think, even people who were Christian believers, to think that faith had nothing to do with science and science had nothing to do with faith, and that probably there was a conflict. And that was in part because back in the 50s and the 60s, we were still in America living in the aftermath of the Scopes, the famous Scopes trial, sometimes called the Scopes monkey trial of the early 20th century, which was popularized into a movie. And of course, Mr. Scopes was a science teacher who was recruited to teach evolution in high school, and that was against the law at that time because it was seen as somehow against the biblical, it certainly is against the biblical narrative of 6 days of creation in Genesis 1 and 2. And so it was against the law, and he was charged with that, and a great sensational trial happened, and it was carried by all the news feeds of the day, and it was talked about throughout our nation. Of course, Mr. Scopes was convicted of teaching creation. I think he was fined $1 or something like that. But it set in motion a time in which biblical Christians retreated from the sciences, and which I feel is really unfortunate. And many parts of the Christian church became very suspicious of higher education. This is when many Bible colleges were started in order to keep people from going to secular colleges. There was a very much an anti-intellectual current within the American evangelical church. I shouldn't call it the evangelical church. In fact, the evangelical church came out of fundamentalism, led by people like Billy Graham and a guy named Carl F.H. Henry and Fuller Seminary. And part of the difference between the evangelicals of the middle and the late 20th century and the earlier fundamentalists was that the evangelicals were not anti-intellectual. They were about pursuing reason and science and asking questions and answering the questions. And they were very optimistic that because God created the world, that the world was intelligible. So there was nothing to fear from higher education. I was very fortunate that I went to a church that, although it was very biblical, it was definitely affected by this movement that Dr. Henry and Billy Graham had started, in which we were encouraged to study science, to go on to universities, and to that the world and the examination of the world, that God created the world, He made it understandable. And so if we were studying science, we were learning the things of God. Today I want to talk about the role of Christianity, actually, not only as a partner with science in understanding the world that God created, but the essential role that Christianity had in the rise of science. In some ways, you can say that Christianity, Christian faith, was the midwife of science. We all know that in the early days of Christianity, there was no science, even though there was a tradition of rational, logical discourse that came from the Greeks. We know that in those days, there were civilizations, notably in China, that were technologically much far in advance of the civilizations in the Mediterranean region where Christianity took hold. So why is it that these other older civilizations never gave root to science? Well, the crucial element that is frequently overlooked or minimized is that there is something about Christian truth that was essential for the rise of science, and it provided the necessary optimism, the sort of moral and metaphysical and institutional foundations that would give birth to science, that would give scientists the freedom to ask questions and to investigate things, and that it also created the great institutions, the academy, the universities that became centers of scientists coming together and working, asking questions together and working for solutions together. One of the very core beliefs of Christian faith is that God is omniscient. He knows everything, but he works as a rational God. Jesus is called in John, the prologue of the Gospel of John, he's called ha logos, the logos, the word. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. And part of the understanding of that Greek word logos is that the logos is logical. That's where we get the word logic or rational, that God acts in ways that are understandable and conform to the laws of reason. And God created an ordered universe. If you just look around us, we see a well-ordered universe. We all obey the laws of gravity. And that's unfortunate if you fall off a ladder, but mostly it's good because when you set your iPod down, it doesn't float away up into the ether. When we see people, I always smile when I see people on the International Space Station where it's weightless and the women's hair frizzes out and things float away, and they're constantly having to put Velcro on things to keep things from float away. So God created a predictable and an amazing universe that obeys physical laws, natural laws, as well as his moral law and his law, the law of his word. This belief allowed Christian believers to look at the natural world and to believe that it could be understood. It wasn't just, remember, have you ever seen the old maps where there was uncharted territory in the map and there would be a picture of a sea monster out there and it might say, "Thar be monsters," that was beyond the known world. And people lived in fear that the unknown, you might fall off the end of the world or there might be monsters out there. The belief in the natural world and the order of the natural world gave human beings the confidence to explore and to investigate every corner of the natural world, knowing that fire would still be fire there, water would still be drinkable there if it was fresh water, that the laws of gravity would still pertain, that the observed nature was not random, but it was created by a God who loved working with logic and order. Very early scientists like Sir Isaac Newton and Johannes Kepler were deeply religious people, and they saw their scientific work as a way of understanding God's creation. Now, some of you have heard of the trial of Galileo as this great confrontation between science and faith, or the church or whatever. And Galileo was forced to recant from his teaching that the earth revolved around the sun. And people point at that as this great showdown that the church and faith was against science. That really is not true. Yes, it's true. Galileo was put on trial. Yes, he was forced to recant. But there were a lot of political issues involved in why Galileo was on trial. And we should also remember that it was a Polish monk, Copernicus, who came before Galileo, who actually invented the notion of a heliocentric solar system, or that the planets revolved around the sun. And of course, Johannes Kepler, who was this great Christian figure, was the one who figured out the laws of planetary motion, that they weren't circular orbits, but they were elliptical orbits. And this was very, very important because the reigning understanding at the time was actually borrowed from a pagan philosopher, Aristotle. And Aristotle believed that circles were more perfect than ellipses, and so that the orbits had to be circular. And Kepler proved them wrong. And it was because he stood on this idea that the world and the solar system was created by God. So anything we find has got to be God's best, because that's the way God created it. So if the elliptical orbits worked for God, then we shouldn't let Aristotle's philosophy keep us from discovering how God made things. Once we have this Christian conviction that the universe is understandable and that the laws of physics pertain, and they are somewhat universal, they're consistent and they're predictable, then it gives the confidence to do some things like explore the human body and how it works. And that's where we get medicine, or to look out into the cosmos and to study the stars and to determine that there's a redshift. And in fact, astronomy in the last 100 years has grudgingly come to support this idea of a Big Bang, that there was a moment of creation. And of course, that doesn't prove that the Bible's right, but there were many, many people when the Big Bang first started to gain some purchase in the scientific community. There were many people who opposed it just because the steady state theory of the universe, that the universe never had a beginning, would never have an end, and was pretty much in a steady state. They wanted that to be true because they didn't like the idea of a creation moment, because that would be consistent with Genesis chapter 1. And so again, there were people who were both Christian who had agendas, but people who were not Christian who had agendas. And fortunately for us, science over time tends to weed out people who have agendas from outside of science. And so science can be a trustworthy guide for us. Christianity not only offered the framework for believing that the universe is predictable and can be measured and can be observed and understood, there also needed to be a moral foundation to the pursuit of scientific knowledge. The Christian believers believe in truth, and they believe in absolute truth, and that truth is loved by God, and God is on the side of truth. In fact, Jesus said, "I am the truth, the way, the truth, and the life." And so Christians are committed to follow truth wherever it leads. And that allows for science to proceed, because often new science will overthrow the previously understood science. When I was in high school, people thought that the smallest subatomic particle was the electron. Electrons are much smaller than protons or neutrons, and we were taught that the three parts of the atom were electrons, protons, and neutrons, and that's true. And those were the smallest parts of matter. Well, when I was in college, someone was doing more work with colliders and with back then they were very primitive, but linear accelerators. There was one at Stanford. There's a cyclotron up the hill at Cal. And they were actually being able to smash electrons and neutrons and protons into smaller bits. And they were talking about things like that you may have heard of, like quarks and the Higgs boson, things like that are smaller. They're subatomic particles. They're actually smaller. So the older models that I grew up on had to be overthrown. And fortunately, Christianity endowed science with this plumb line that you follow what is true, even if you don't like what you find. You follow what is true. And there have been numerous times when my father's generation, he was GI in the war, and they thought that smoking was good for you. And then the evidence accumulated during the 60s and the 70s that smoking will give you lung cancer. And it's good that the truth overthrew that which was previously thought. Christian emphasis sees truth-seeking as a virtue because we believe that every truth is God's truth. So we can't just say, well, we like circles better than ellipses. And so if you believe that there's an elliptical path around the sun for the earth, that you can't be truth because God wouldn't make an imperfect orbit like an ellipse. Well, when you find that the earth has an elliptical orbit and you find that really helps with things like, seasons and tides and things like that, you can say, well, maybe we don't know the mind of God, but as we find those truths, we can say, wow, isn't that amazing? God's a lot more complex than we thought. The orbital mechanics is a lot more complex than we thought, and yet God spoke it into being in an instant. The early universities were almost all founded primarily by Christians, both to provide pastors for the churches, theologians for the churches, but also those who would follow other disciplines into medicine, into science, into logic, into rhetoric, though everything that the modern university has. Many early scientists were also clergy people. You may remember probably when you were a junior, maybe sophomore in high school, learning about genetics, early genetics. And you remember a guy named Frederick Mendel, and he crossbred strains of, it's been so long, I think they were peas. And he was able to determine that certain characteristics of his peas were heritable, but they were recessive genes. And then some, if you put two recessive genes together, the next generation would have that trait would proceed to the front again. And he was kind of the father of modern genetics. Well, he happened to be a priest and a monk, and he was doing all of his experimentation in the monastery kitchen, working within a theological framework that saw their scientific discoveries twofold as a deeper understanding of God's word, God's world, and a reason to give praise to God. And secondly, in developing things that would be helpful to other human beings, and therefore it would be consistent to God's mission of redeeming and saving human beings. The Christian church played a crucial institutional role in supporting the rise of science, and that's still somewhat true today. Much of that early influence, of course, has been scrubbed in the days of defacing monuments and things like that. No longer is the motto of Harvard University, Veritas. It used to be Veritas means truth. It was truth for Christ and his church. And now they've expunged or erased the for Christ and his church. And it's simply Veritas is the motto of Harvard. But to begin with, when Harvard was founded, it was truth for Christ and his church. The universities that have been founded for the church are still centers of learning where the study of nature and this discovery of scientific truth continues to go on. And science itself has borrowed, without the faith connection, but it's borrowed some of our faith convictions that the world is logical, subject to reason, subject to observation, and that science is powerful and deserves respect. The church is not an opponent of scientific inquiry. Fortunately, however, the church sometimes acts as the conscience of science, and particularly in our day, is asking very important questions about the limits of scientific research. As more and more people suspect that the emergence of the COVID pandemic may have come from human experimentation as opposed to accidental emergence. And I really don't have an opinion on that, haven't studied it. But as people are aware that genetic engineering can create things like that, the church is a voice in saying, just because something can be done doesn't mean it should be done. And so there's still a function of Christians being the conscience of scientific research. Modern science can't be understood apart from its Christian context, and the worldview that Christianity provided allowed science not only to begin, but to proceed. And so please don't think of science as the enemy of faith. I believe that science is actually all we're doing is we're studying the world that God has made. Certainly there are people who want to use science to attack faith. That's their agenda. There's nothing about science that is anti-faith. And likewise, faith should not be in the business of being anti-science. We should be open to the answers that science brings, because ultimately all of the answers that we find are God's answers. God's about truth. He created the universe, and we have nothing to fear by walking in his path behind him to see how he made things. Well, thanks for joining us today. Again, we want your opinions, so please, if you see me in church, or Pastor Ricky, or Kevin, who's doing the engineering, please let us know what you think about this. Is this helpful? If you have questions, we are going to do Q&A podcasts from time to time to address people's real questions about faith, and occasionally we're going to have guests from our church family to share about their story of faith, and in order to inspire us and to give us an understanding of each other and to tighten up our community. Well, that's about all we have for today. Again, thanks for checking us out, and come back next week for the next episode of Thinking About Faith. God bless you all.